welcome to People Like Us, a podcast for and about third culture kids everywhere. I'm Jen Mohindra. I'm also a TCK, and I have a Facebook group for TCK adults called, unsurprisingly, People Like Us. So, hello, and on today's episode of People Like Us, I'm delighted to have my guest today, who is Stephen Yap. Stephen, welcome.
Hi, Jenny.
Thank you for joining me. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me on today.
Pleasure. So, as usual, I'm going to jump straight in, and my opening question, as always, is tell me, where did you grow up?
Gosh, I think a lot of people listening to this podcast probably hesitate when faced with that question. Even knowing that you're going to ask me that question, I'm hesitating. I think, and I'm gonna apologise in advance because I tend to give very long-winded answers, and if you're looking for straight, concise answers, I'm not your person. But hopefully, I'll get to the point eventually. I think that the term "growing up" can mean a lot of things, and I think for me the best way to approach that question is, where do you spend your formative years? So you can define your formative years in a number of ways. I define them as the years that had the biggest influence on me in terms of my values, my worldview, the people that I met during those years, the education that I received, the influences culturally that stick with me today. And I think for most people, that applies to your childhood. So I'll come back to that, and I'll give you the sort of the linear answer, which is I was born in Hong Kong. I moved to the UK and became naturalized in the UK at the age of 5. I then grew up and spent my childhood years in the UK until adulthood. After I graduated from university, I then went to North America, spent some time in North America, and then ended up back in Hong Kong, of all places, where I then spent 16 years, had children there, got married there, and then came back to the UK in my late 30s, which is where I am now and most likely will be for a very long time. So the answer is I grew up in Hong Kong in the UK in terms of the years 0 to 17 or 18, shall we say. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of the logical answer, but I feel like I grew up everywhere because everywhere I've been has left its own impressions on me and has made me who I am today in terms of how I see things. So my time in North America had an influence on me. If not literally, I did a bit of growing up there. My second stint in Hong Kong as an adult had a huge impact on me. So if it's possible to grow up as an adult, then I certainly grew up a lot when I was in Hong Kong. So I'm British, but I'm also Hong Kong Chinese. I'm proud to be both.
That's really interesting. The where did you spend your formative years as to where did you grow up? And I hear you on the where did you grow up, because yes, we can do growing up at all stages. Interesting comment. So what makes a place feel like home for you?
I think, again, the answer is not a static answer. I think I've been very fortunate that I've had the opportunity to live in a number of different places and experience different parts of the world and different cultures. And when I look back on that, I believe that I made the right decisions in terms of where to spend my time. And again, very fortunate that I had those options available to me. But it's very much tied in with life stage. So, well, I mean, at the age of 5, I didn't make the decision to come to the UK, but I'm very, very lucky and glad that I did, because I think, the opportunity to go to school in the UK and, if you like, quote unquote, grow up, as in spend my childhood in the UK, was a very good thing. but I'm also incredibly grateful for that time that I spent in North America as a young adult, which opened my eyes and broadened my horizons, and has left me indelibly um, with impressions, and it has had an impact way beyond the actual amount of time that I spent there. And I'm also lucky that I got to go back to Hong Kong and spend some time in Asia later. And what feels like home, I think, it depends on life stage. What
Mm-hmm.
feels like home, I think the consistent part of the answer is where, when you're in a place where you have the opportunity to meet and interact with people and be surrounded by culture and values that allow you to be yourself, allow you to express yourself, and allow you to discover aspects of yourself and ultimately experience what, for want of a better word, I would describe as a certain amount of freedom. And I think um, home is where you feel free. Home is where you feel comfortable. Home is where you feel like you can be yourself. And that can be different depending on your stage of life. So, like most of us, I'm in my late 40s now. I've gone through multiple stages of life, and what was good for me then isn't necessarily good for me now. But
For
it was
sure.
good for me then, and it felt like home then. It might not feel like home now. I'm not sure if going back to the United States today at my stage of life would feel like home, but it certainly felt like home when I was 22.
I resonate very strongly with that from my own experience, which I see some parallels in. For me, my 20s I spent in Sydney, and that was the best place I could have been. I think I absolutely loved it there. That was my home. I made it so. But now that I live in London and I've been here a number of years, Sydney, yeah, it's still one of my homes, but I'm at a different period in my life now, and I don't think I have the same affinity with it as I did back then. So, your first move, probably as an adult, you moved to the USA. Tell me about that. What was that like?
In the early 90s, I had just graduated, and rather like now, there was a recession going on, that jobs were hard to come by. Again, being in a very fortunate position, I realized that rather than working for a living, I had the option to actually travel for a little while. And what I ended up doing was traveling for a year in North America, in the USA and Canada, and I ended up doing some more education. So I did further education in the
Mm-hmm.
USA. And it was a specific choice that I'd made. To a certain extent, it was influenced by family members. My family, who have their origins in Hong Kong, actually moved, my immediate family, my parents and my brother, moved from London to Vancouver, British Columbia, in the
Mm-hmm.
early 1990s. They were following a large-scale wave of immigration. It was one of the first waves of Chinese immigration to Canada that happened in the early 90s, dominantly comprised of Hong Kong people. So a lot of my family, my parents and their family, took the opportunity at that point to move to Canada. So I actually graduated in the early 90s, and when I graduated, my parents and my brother had already moved. And I decided to spend some time over there and really see what it was all about. And I ended up spending 3 years doing further education in the United States, just across the Canadian border, actually in Washington State. And I think for a lot of people, the opportunity to go to places like that is a dream, and it was a dream. It was 2 or 3, it was 3 or 4 years of the most amazing experiences that I could ever have, and it opened my eyes in so many ways.
And so then after the USA, you spent time in Hong Kong and then back to the UK. That move back to the UK, what was that like for you?
It was really hard, Jenny, and I think it wasn't a complete surprise. I was expecting a certain amount of reverse culture shock, but the reality of experiencing that reverse culture shock and just going through that was probably tougher than I'd anticipated. And anybody who's been through an experience, I'm sure, would agree you can't prepare yourself for something like that. So when you've spent a lot of time in a place, when you've quote unquote grown up in a place, spent your formative years, but then have been away for a long time and then come back to that place, to realize that in the time between when you were last there, you have changed a lot and you've been exposed to a lot of different things, and the place has changed as well. And coming back, a lot of things, it was a bizarre mix of the familiar and the not so familiar. I think the hardest thing for me to adjust to was the working culture in the UK. So in some ways, the personal, there were some things about my friends, and there were people that I had been friends with that I realized we'd just grown apart. I think that happens even if you don't move away, doesn't it? When you get older, you just end up growing apart from some of the friends that you knew when you were younger. But having only really worked, I started my career actually in the USA. So I did some work while I was still there, and then predominantly I built my career in Asia. And I'd built my career over 16 years in Asia. So I'd gone from essentially a baby to to an experienced professional in Asia. And coming back to the UK as an experienced professional and readjusting to the British work culture was a massive shock, massive shock to the system in so many ways that I could talk for hours on end about. And even to this day, I've been back now for 12 years. Been back in the UK for 12 years. I still don't think I'm fully acculturated to it.
Yeah. Well, what doesn't feel right?
I think it was when I realized how much the time in Hong Kong, my second period in Hong Kong, had really become part of me. When I was younger, and I'm sure a lot of people, third culture kids, will identify with this. When I was younger, I didn't have any Chinese friends, and it wasn't because I rejected them. I just didn't know any Chinese people. And I didn't speak Chinese growing up at all. Spoke only English, and basically I was no different to all the white British kids around me. And that was how I identified myself. And my self-identity, my values were 100% white British. I was indistinguishable from white British. And then I spent 20 years overseas, and then I came back to realize that actually I was no longer white British. And the Chinese side of me, even without me having been aware of it, had come much more to the fore, and that had its expression very, very clearly within the working environment. There are some significant differences between Asian professional norms and British professional norms. I got feedback when I came back from my colleagues and my line manager that I was too aggressive, I was too direct, that I needed to just chill out a little bit, and I needed to work harder to build relationships with my colleagues. I was too authoritarian, and they were right, because the reality is what works in the office in a place like Hong Kong does not work in the UK. And I had imported that way of working, which was how this is another part of growing up. So my work growing up, my infancy and teenage years from a professional standpoint were all spent in Hong Kong and Asia. So that was the style and that was the culture that I was used to. And coming straight off the plane into London and operating in that way did not work. It got a lot of people's backs up, and I had to actively moderate and change my style, my communication, my language, the way I interacted with the people in Hong Kong. Predominantly, people are extremely straightforward, I would say, when it comes to work, and there's just no nonsense. There's no messing about. In the UK, people like to be asked their opinions.
Yes.
In Hong Kong, no one cares. No one wants to be asked their opinion. They just want to know what to do, and then they do it. In the UK, before people do things, you need to have some conversation. You need to share opinions. People need to buy into the idea that it's a good idea to do something before they'll actually do something. And I needed time to readjust to that way to learn that way of working. And having had a fairly successful career in Hong Kong and coming to the UK and getting a lot of bad feedback and seeming to annoy a lot of people, it was it was just a shock to the system.
How did you feel about having to adapt, having come from being so established and I assume successful in your field, to having to change quite dramatically? How did that make you feel?
I can look back on it now, and I can look back on it objectively and say it was an excellent experience, because I think life is about learning, life is about discovery, life is not about standing still. For me, it's always about growing, and this, along with many other experiences, has helped me to grow. At the time, it was incredibly hard. It shook me to the core. When, exactly as you say, when you become established and you have this image that you build up of yourself, and then you go to a different environment, and all of that comes down, and you're actually told you're not good at your job, you're not effective because you're not doing things the right way. That's pretty tough.
Yeah, for sure. So what do you know now that you would have liked to have known to have made that easier?
I learned late in life. I think a lot of people, particularly these days, there's a lot more general awareness of concepts like what is good and what is not so good communication in the office, particularly in the UK. And make no mistake, I've got zero regrets for coming to the UK, and I am, in hindsight, incredibly glad about everything, and grateful for everything I've gone through, as difficult as it was at the time. I am so much more aware now since I've come back to the UK, so much more self-aware, so much more aware of how I come across to people. I have, and it's still something I have to work very hard at. And I admire people to whom this comes naturally and easily, but I have to work very hard at. But I am much more aware than I was in my 30s of how to flex my communication style to suit the people that I'm talking to. And I can completely understand now, sitting here talking to you years later, how I'd come across as, a really authoritarian boss who had very little empathy and was just barking orders, because that's what I did. Because that's what worked. And that's how I grew up in a work environment. But it sounds a bit glib, but actually I've learned to ask people what they think. I never used to ask people what they think. What do you think? What do you think? Tip to anybody going the other way, Jenny. If you know anybody going the other way, if anybody's listening to this, if anybody's is thinking of going from the UK to Asia, don't ask people in Asia what they think. They don't want to be asked that.
Yeah, I can imagine. So what was it like then, the transition before that, when you left the US and went to Hong Kong and lived there and had your children there?
That was I never thought as a teenager or a student that I'd end up back in Hong Kong. I thought I'd probably marry a British girl and we'd settle in the UK. As it happened, I ended up in the States. I met my future wife in the States, who was from Hong Kong, and that's how I ended up back in Hong Kong. And the initial readjustment, there was an adjustment. I spoke Cantonese as a very small child, but stopped speaking it from the age of 5 on, and didn't speak it again for another 20 years. And somehow I managed to pick it back up. I wouldn't say I was absolutely fluent. If I was sitting in front of Hong Kong people today speaking Cantonese, they'd very quickly pick up that I wasn't a local. But I can get by, and I could get by. I managed to pick it up quickly within a couple of years, actually. And that was an amazing, help, because when you live in I guess I can't even call it a foreign city, because it was the city where I was born. But when you move to a place that doesn't, that as an English speaker and you don't speak the language, you're forever, to a certain extent, doesn't matter how long you live there, if you don't speak the local language, you're always on the outside to a certain extent. You're always on the fringes, and you'll never really plug in to what's really going on and feel completely connected to culture if you don't speak the language. So the fact that I could speak the language I think was incredibly beneficial, and I was fortunate to be, to have had that background when I was younger and to be able to pick it back up. So I could speak. Within a couple of years, I could speak the language again, and I have to say that I flourished in Hong Kong, and my time there, particularly the early years, were some of the most joyful, precious, successful, confident years that I'd ever had. I really bloomed in a way that uh, hadn't happened before that, and actually hasn't happened since then. And some of that, I think, is just the stage of life. I think a lot of people go through a period in their late 20s and early 30s. You're at the steep end of your career. You're on the up and up. You're perhaps not right now given everything that's going on, but at the time in Hong Kong the economy was amazing, and I was getting promoted and my salary was increasing massively year on year. And I was starting to get to know a lot of people. Hong Kong's an easy place to meet people, and I just felt the most confident and powerful that I'd ever been. And it was an incredible feeling. I'd never had that feeling before, and I actually haven't had it since. I've not had it since I come back to the UK.
So, of course, that leads me to then ask, what was behind the decision to come back to the UK when everything was going so well in Hong Kong?
So we talked about feeling like home, and as you progress through different stages of life, different places make different have different strengths and weaknesses. And Hong Kong is an amazing place when you're a young professional and pre-children. I always describe it to people as a little bit like going back to university.
Okay.
Hong Kong, especially if you are, again, for me, not a foreigner, but also not local. So most of my friends and acquaintances in Hong Kong were not native Hong Kong people, but people like me, including many other Chinese, overseas Chinese, who many of whom spoke Cantonese, but were acculturated in North America, Europe, Australia, and it was incredible just to meet people who had, even people who from outside of the UK, but the fact as a overseas born Chinese, surrounded by other overseas born Chinese and also just other overseas people, all of whom, there's a certain type of person then and today that you will find in Hong Kong. They tend to be driven, ambitious, hardworking, but also hard playing. And you're all there, and it's people come and go because a lot of people there only for a few years before they move on somewhere else, and it's just that sort of place. You can make a lot of money, you can progress really quickly in your career, you can spend a lot of money, you can really live your life. But when our children came along, then we embarked on a new chapter in our journey, and it was time to go back to the UK. The UK doesn't have that energy. Even London doesn't have that energy that Hong Kong has even today, and Hong Kong is a much diminished version of the Hong Kong that I arrived in 1996. But even today, I would say Hong Kong, there's a certain energy that Hong Kong has that it's very hard to replicate anywhere in the world. And it's just that combination of people who everybody that I interacted with, friend with. Can you imagine this? A city full of third culture kids.
Brilliant.
Can you imagine that? A place full of third culture kids, all there, all bound by the fact that you're third culture kids, with money in your pocket, and fun to be had. That's the sort of place that Hong Kong was. And I loved it. I thrived. But it's also a place that is, for want of a better term, pretty shallow. And when you sort of get beyond the partying and the shopping, there's not a lot there. Sorry to anybody who's listening in Hong Kong. And realistically, as you get older, you start to crave other things, and you start to crave the things that started to really matter to me as my children came along were the ability to live in a place where you felt like you were, you had some participation in the public life of the place. And unfortunately, Hong Kong then and now is not a place where that exists. In Hong Kong, you go there, you make a lot of money, you have a lot of material wealth, but you're not part of the public life of the place, because the public life of the place is just not controlled by the people. I wanted to live in a place, and I wanted my children to live in a place where there was rich public discourse, a lively press, lots of conversations and ideas of all kinds. And going into my late 30s, and as my children started to grow up, it occurred to us that the UK was a far richer environment than Hong Kong for children to grow up.
So your children then, having had their very early years in Hong Kong and then moving to the UK, if they're presented with the classic hard question for us, where are you from? How would they respond to that?
UK. No, it's interesting, isn't it? How, whether by design or by accident, history repeats itself. So I moved here when I was 4/5. My two sons moved here. My older son was 5 when we moved. My younger son was 4 when we moved. So they're about the same age. Now they may end up treading a similar path and going back to Asia. Probably not, I would say. But who knows? But if you catch them now today, they would be very much like me and I was when I was 16 and 17. If you'd asked me that question when I was 16, I'd say unreservedly, I'm from the UK. No question. There was no debate at that time.
Common struggle or challenge, if you like, for many TCKs is around the feeling of being rootless and restless. And it sounds to me like you've come back home and this is your home now. What would you be able to offer any sort of words of advice to other TCKs who are wondering how to find that place to be their home?
I can share my own journey. Whether or not that can also apply to others is not for me to say. I think we're all individuals, and the way that we respond to situations and events is always rooted in who we are in individuals. And the first thing I would say is that, as difficult as it was at times, I do believe I've totally come to terms with it, and I'm completely at peace with it. It's harder when you're younger to be at peace with these things. When you're younger, the sense of needing to belong, the sense of needing to be part of a tribe is really, really strong, really strong. As you get older, and now in my late 40s, actually, that sense has diminished. Instead, what's replaced it is really a pride in just being who I am. And it doesn't matter if people get me or not. It really, honestly doesn't matter. I know who I am. And I think what my experiences have left me with is that sort of sense of comfort in just being unique. And if people don't get me, it's okay. And maybe sometimes that can manifest itself negatively, because a lot of people say that I'm very difficult to understand and very difficult to know. And I completely see why that is, because these days I don't make much effort. If people don't relate to me, that's their issue.
Yeah.
I don't feel the need to as you do when you're younger, and things, having a great social life and being embedded with people, is also, is so much more of a thing when you're younger. And these days, I'm just happy to do my own thing. I guess the advice I would have is love yourself, be proud in who you are. And there are people out there who are like you. You might not always have know who they are or where they are, but there are people that are like you. I think it's easier today to connect through social media and through, things like this amazing podcast, and to feel that there is support and there is a tribe and there is kinship out there. But fundamentally, work on yourself, work on
Mm.
yourself, work on your confidence, work on your, knowing your own strengths, because for me that is the best way to combat any feeling of being isolated or rootless. Because if you take your if you you know if you derive your strength and your happiness from predominantly from external factors, like being part of a culture, then that can be a challenge when you're in a place where you don't feel connected to that culture. I'm fortunate to be at where I am in my journey, where I actually derive my strength from internal sources, from myself. I know who I am. I'm happy with who I am.
It sounds to me like your sense of home is that you're at home within yourself.
Completely. Now, as I said, that works for me. It doesn't work for all people.
Yeah, for
We're we're
sure.
we're all different. What I think my journey has left me with is a very, very strong self-reliance and a very strong independence.
Uh,
And that might not be the right path for other people, but it's really worked for me.
I think that's one that many TCKs and many people listening to this will certainly be able to relate to. Stephen, we've been chatting for 30 minutes-ish already. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's been so
It has.
interesting. Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much for being my guest today.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Pleasure. Thanks for listening to People Like Us. If you'd like to join an online community full of people like us, hop over to Facebook and search for People Like Us. You'll find my group, and you're very welcome to join us.